Well, I should start out probably, since Astrid will likely have access to viewing the recording of this session. I should apologize in advance that hopefully I don't mangle her paper too much. I'm doing a little bit of editing as I go here to try and fit into our time frame, so hopefully she won't be too dissatisfied with what I'm saying here. I'll start first with 3 examples. Jesus Christ, the King of the Jews, a name which has become a mockery for many, but for Mennonites there is more in this name, power, and the sense of all our being. Those are a couple of lines from a sermon in 1935 at the Conference of West Prussian Mennonites by Jakob Kröker. A second example, in the 1990s, Bernhard Gingerich, originally from Königsberg in East Prussia, wrote his memoirs in which he described his youth in the National Socialist era. Gingerich was born in 1925 and thus was 14 when the Second World War began. He remembers that the social atmosphere turned more and more hostile against the Jews as he was a youth and a child. Political communication, Gingerich describes, invented very elaborated argumentation to separate Christian faith from Judaism. One argument was that Jesus Christ could not have been a Jew since he preached in Aramaic. What happened in the concentration camps was not known, or rather nobody wanted to know it, says Gingerich. He also characterizes the Mennonites in his youth and states that among them there was a certain level of calmness or indifference. Nobody was terribly concerned about the changes. Those who knew things remained silent. The third example, Gingerich's statement that among Mennonites nobody was terribly concerned about changes in society, and that an anti-Jewish atmosphere didn't seem strange, is substantiated by the third example, a Mennonite preacher of Krefeld, Gustav Kramer, whom we've already heard from. His 1938 writing, Wir in unserer Volksgemeinschaft, we in our racial community. He comments in general, as he writes, about the Jewish question, and goes on to comment on the function of the Old Testament. Already in the first pages of the Old Testament, we are confronted with cultural universals of a high level, but also with much which is fundamentally foreign, art fremd, for us repulsive things, such as when farming and motherhood are only seen as a curse. The 3 examples describe the range of theological and intellectual convictions attending to Judaism and the role of the Old Testament during National Socialist eras. Many different voices came from the Mennonite side that contributed to the debate and addressed the various questions in contemporary sermons, speeches, and articles. This wide range of opinions makes clear that oversimplification is out of place when one tries to characterize the attitude of Mennonites toward Judaism in the Old Testament. If one wants to grasp the Mennonites of National Socialism as a group, one has to differentiate. Nothing is ever black and white among the Mennonites in that time period. If one person might agree on one aspect of National Socialism, the same person could disagree with other aspects of the ideology. This might seem ambiguous from our perspective today, but it reflects the slow coming to terms with new times and new notions in the changing social political atmosphere. It took time for people to recognize new ideas and new ways of thinking. Contemporaries first had to confront themselves with what was in the air, and each person had to find their own position towards it and in the newly shaped society. This also encompassed dealing with the relation of the Jewish and Christian traditions that seemingly could not really be separated from each other. In the language of the times, the debate was named the Jewish question, or Judenfrage. Christians and Mennonites had to discover the depth and the impact of German racial religiosity that from a certain point on dominated the theological debates in the National Socialist era. And then the question was raised, if the Old Testament would be useful for Christians and if the Old Testament in itself should keep its validity. The German Christian movement in particular attacked the Old Testament as anti-German. The theme of the relationship of Old and New Testaments is one of long-standing in Anabaptist and Mennonite theology, so some of these debates were not entirely new, but now took place in a very different context. Mennonite expressions of opinions about Jews were also not entirely new. One can assume that German Mennonites, at least in the 19th century, shared broader anti-Jewish attitudes that were part of their culture. Mennonite opinions about Jews appeared in Mennonite newspapers as early as 1847 in Karl Harder's Monatsschrift. In many cases, these discussions were in the context of missions intending to convert Jews. In other cases, they were more theological about the status of present-day Jews in God's plan of salvation. There was a major round of this theological discussion in 1878 in the Gemeindeblatt der Mennoniten, the South German paper. In a 1903 article about Jewish missions that appeared in the Gemeindeblatt began to use some of the language that became dominant in the 20th century. The author there now justified his opinion with racial or ethnic arguments that were ideologically charged with anti-Semitic resentments. The mission to the Jews would be an obligation towards our German people. As justification, he also brings forward formulations that are well known now from later times. The Jewish spirit would inflict great damage to the German people. Usurious and unreliable actions would beggar the German farmers and tradesmen. Furthermore, the Jews, who the author also named as enemies of our Savior, would lampoon and mock Christian churches and Christian faith. And remember, this is a 1903 article. This is not 1930s or 1940s. So these contributions in Mennonite publications of the 19th and early 20th century now lead us into discussion of the descriptions of Old Testament issues in the National Socialist era. One place to start with this is sermons. A very extensive collections of sermons that has survived derives from the preacher of the Weierhof Mennonite congregation, Christian Neff, who is also known for being a founder of Mennonite World Conference and a variety of other denominational activities. If we just rely on the numbers of the sermons, there seems to be a clear preference. Out of a total of nearly 2,000 sermons that have survived, Christian Neff preached 99 sermons about Old Testament texts, and from these 99 sermons, 7 belong in the National Socialist era. It should be noted that Neff was not afraid of using Old Testament references in the content of his sermons as opposed to the text. And one additional consideration is that he was likely influenced by the traditional Anabaptist and Mennonite leanings toward New Testament usage. The fact that, the fact that Christian Neff would continue to rely on Old Testament texts and shows appreciation for them shows up in the content of his sermons. He does not put the Old Testament in the context of a language using racial and ethnic concepts. He uses positive ascriptions about Old Testament Judaism, which don't reflect the National Socialist ideology in regard to anti-Semitism. In general, Neff was an advocate of respecting the Old Testament as important for Christian faith. Well known is his admonition that he sent to the gathering of Southwest German Mennonite elders in Heilbronn in June 1935. He cautions them not to join with voices that mock the Old Testament into absurdity and serve to tear children away from the Christian faith. And for Neff, this was an advocation in the context of reviving Mennonite youth work. Those sermons are an excellent source for measuring the quantity and the quality of dealing with the Old Testament. We often face a source problem. Only a few collections of sermons have been handed down, but there are also speeches at conferences and gatherings of churches and youth assemblies where the role of the Old Testament was a topic. The Mennonite preacher at Danzig, Erich Güttner, was active in bringing to mind the positives of the Old Testament, publishing several articles in Mennonite journals such as Mennonitische Blätter and the Jugendwarte. Until the end of the 1930s, relatively positive articles about the role of the Old Testament appeared in the official publications, the Mennonitische Blätter and the Gemeindeblatt and the Jugendwarte. Erich Güttner was one of the prominent authors of many of these articles, but also Walter Fellmann, who was the pastor at Monsheim and Obersulzen, was another prominent writer of some of these. They tended to refute or push back against the ethnic and racially based critique of the Old Testament. And already in 1927, when Güttner was the pastor at Ebersheim, an article that he published in the Mennonitische Blätter dealt with the topic of Christendom and ethnicity. He declared ethnicity a main reference figure also for Christians because it was, quote, most precious, although still not redeemed, creation. But he also warned that ethnicity should never be an absolute value for Christians, and it should never exceed God's kingdom, which was the aim of all hope as a Christian. Nevertheless, Güttner, as you can imagine, doesn't leave out some of the anti-Semitic themes that were in the air, and some of his terminology does refer to ethnic or racial anti-Jewish polemic. For example, he talks of Jews that do damage to German society due to their encroachment in various spheres of society. On the other hand, he steps back by saying that the Verjudung or Judaizing, and he puts that word himself in quotation marks, could not serve as the only explanation for the decline in our racial life. Besides this, he warns against a hubris of a single race toward another race. In God's judgment, he says, there is no human being, no nation, no race without failure. Güttner furthermore criticizes the calls for purification of the Bible from Jewish content. He labels that a mistake or an Irrung. Society, he said, was ready to make an idol, a false god of blood, and to put race in the place of God. In 1937, Güttner writes in the Jugendwarte that blood and race had falsely become the new sacraments. Güttner continued to be an advocate for the Old Testament until the end of the 1930s and remained a critic of uncritical transmission of contemporary ideas into the history of the people of Israel. Another article that he had in the Mennonitische Blätter in 1935 was a published version of a paper or sermon he had given several times in various places, in Danzig in December of 1934 and in Berlin in January of 35, where he praises the Old Testament as the book that precedes the New Testament and points to it and shows God's presence and power, exactly the same language that he had used back in his 1927 writing. In the 1935 article, Güttner lists off characteristics of the Old Testament God of sovereignty, freedom, power, holiness, benevolence, and names omnipotence as a quality which he understood as God's knowing the current situation of life of each individual person and also of each nation. For Güttner, it followed that God is a God not limited to a single nation. God would not only be a mere God of nations and not the God only of the people of Israel, but of God of all nations. Güttner also addresses charges that the God of the Old Testament would be a God of wrath and judgment and revenge. He rejects these charges by ascribing to God's judgment a meaning that calls someone with and out of love and benevolence and out of care for the people. To the argument that the Old Testament was art-fremd, fundamentally alien, Jewish and Semitic, Güttner responds by stating that the Old Testament talks about certain persons, such as Moses and the prophets, who cautioned the Israelites against error. And let me skip a little bit here. Gittner pays a lot of attention to the manner in which the Old Testament points to the New Testament. As the Anabaptists in the 16th century had stated, Gittner also said that the Old Testament prepared the path for God's perfect salvation in Jesus Christ. In the Old Testament, Jesus himself had found the basic concepts of his message, and only to the God of the Old Testament was Jesus able to say Father. In his Sermon on the Mount, Jesus, on the one hand, tied in the Old Testament, and the other hand, extended and continued it. If the Old Testament were to be abandoned, as German Christians called for, the historical soil would be destroyed in which God's revelation in Jesus Christ was grounded, and Jesus' coming and work would be incomprehensible in many aspects. Finally, Gittner states that the Old Testament was Jesus' Bible, and already in the Old Testament a deep sense of sin was obvious. On the other hand, we find contributions such as those of the Krefeld pastor, Gustav Kramer, who denied that the Old Testament could serve as a role model for Christians. In a sermon he preached at Heubuden in 1942, he focused on Jesus Christ and the Bible, but emphasized that he could take the Bible into account only insofar as it would give evidence of Jesus, a formulation that hides a fundamental critique of the Old Testament. According to Kramer, it was not comprehensible why the Old Testament would still be printed, and everybody knew that Christians had nothing to do with the writings of the Old Testament. Definitely nothing, he said. Moses was given to the people of Israel and doesn't concern the heathens or the Christians. And in general, thus Kramer was in the mainstream of National Socialist and German Christian propaganda. The Old Testament would be a Jewish book written for and by Jews, and in part sub-Christian or even anti-Christian. Kramer portrays the Old Testament Israelites as arrogant and haughty. In 1938, he wrote that there would be no nation with more self-awareness and self-righteousness and with more fanatic racial hatred than the Jewish people. He finds evidence for these accusations already in the Old Testament. The Jewish people were a fremd folk, an alien nation, of their own accord because they practiced separation from other nations very deliberately. And they thought of themselves as a state within the state. It seems to be easy for Kramer to draw a line to his own times and the descriptions of Jews contained in words such as parasites who infiltrated societies in many ways. Again, a contrast with the different lessons drawn by people like Gittner from the Old Testament and the story of Israel, who warned the German nation not to be presumptuous toward the people of Israel. Gittner said in his 1935 article, all temperamental weaknesses that are ascribed to the people of Israel could also fit every other human being. He asks if the personal and racial hatred against enemies, human self-confidence, the proudness of a racial, ethnic discrimination were only Jewish features, or do they not recur to all human beings in every epoch as a sign of our natural character and bondage? Thus, one tendency of Mennonite interpretation of the Old Testament in this era was to draw lessons, one way or another, from the history of the Israelites for the current German nation. The starting point and center of these arguments was the question to what extent the people of Israel would do justice to their being chosen by God. So to summarize briefly, as we have seen, Mennonite authors and preachers saw the relevance of the Old Testament very differently in this era. Gustav Kramer's words were openly affected by National Socialist nomenclature and condemnations, and thus the Old Testament had no reason for existence in contemporary theology. On the other side, we have those contributions that highlighted the value of Old Testament for Christians. And furthermore, some authors continued with a critique of their own German nation that they substantiated by parallels with the Old Testament history of Israel. It was a warning about hubris and godlessness and about an idolatry of blood and race. We don't know of any practical consequences that came to Mennonites who avoided or opposed condemning the Old Testament. It's possible that there could have been some that are not known. There was a case of a bishop, a non-Mennonite case of a bishop of Hamburg, Volkmar Hendrich, who was punished by having to resign from his professorship in Kiel in 1935 because he had acknowledged the importance of the Old Testament in a lecture that he gave. So Astrid concludes by giving greetings to the conference from Weierhof and apologies for not being here. So thank you.